July 16th, 1945. Alamogordo, New Mexico. The desert was still and silent before dawn. A silence so complete that the scientists waiting in the scrub could hear their own heartbeats. Miles of copper wire snaked across the sand, leading toward a tall steel tower carrying a single, grapefruit-shaped weapon. It was called the Gadget. Physicist Robert Oppenheimer stood behind thick goggles, his hand clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project, gave the nod. A code phrase crackled through the radio. Now, let there be light. At 5:29 a.m., the world changed forever. The flash lit the desert brighter than any sunrise. A column of fire rose, swallowing the tower, turning sand into glass. The shock wave rolled across the valley and slammed into the observation bunkers, flattening scrub, tearing dust from the earth. Men ducked, covered their ears, and stared at the impossible. A sun born from science. When the roar finally faded, there was only wind and disbelief. Oppenheimer murmured words from the Bhagavad Gita. And now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. 3 years of secrecy, $20 billion, and the labor of 130,000 men and women, all hidden behind fences in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, had produced humanity's first nuclear weapon. The Manhattan Project had succeeded, but no one yet knew what that success meant. That same day, a B-29 crew practiced long-range bombing runs over the Pacific, unaware they'd soon carry the deadliest cargo in history. And 6,000 miles away, in Tokyo, Japan's Supreme War Council was still vowing to fight to the last man, even as cities burned nightly under American firebombs. By July, 67 Japanese cities had been reduced to ashes. Tokyo's March 9th raid alone killed more civilians than any single attack in history. Over 100,000 dead in one night. Yet Emperor Hirohito remained silent, and the generals promised glorious resistance. For the United States, the path ahead was clear but terrifying. Invade or annihilate. President Harry S. Truman, only months into office after Roosevelt's death, faced an impossible decision. Intelligence from Operation Downfall predicted up to 1 million American casualties if Japan were invaded. The Joint Chiefs feared that even starvation, blockade, and endless bombing wouldn't break Japan's will. But now, the desert had answered a terrible question. The bomb worked. On July 21st, Truman received word from General Groves at Potsdam. Results successful beyond expectations. That same night, he dined with Churchill and Stalin. His demeanor changed. Witnesses said he walked taller. He'd just learned that America held a weapon capable of ending the war and rewriting the balance of power forever. In the Pacific, air crews at Tinian Island were briefed under strict secrecy. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th Composite Group, was ordered to select and train a hand-picked team of B-29 pilots. Their mission: deliver a single bomb that could destroy an entire city. Each man was told only what he needed to know. Each flight was covered under silverplate clearance, and every hour brought them closer to history's most fateful moment. Truman's diary from Potsdam reads, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark." But even as the president wrote those words, scientists like Leo Szilard and Joseph Rotblat begged him not to use it. They argued Japan was already beaten. The weapon should only be demonstrated, not unleashed on a populated city. The military disagreed. The bomb was not just a weapon, it was a message to Tokyo, to Berlin, and to Moscow. At 8 a.m. on July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration. Its words were simple: on surrender unconditionally, or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan refused to reply. The emperor stayed silent. And so, the countdown began. Colonel Tibbets named his aircraft after his mother, Enola Gay. The bomb was codenamed Little Boy, and its destination, still undecided, was hidden under another list of names: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. July 25, 1945, Washington, D.C. In a small, dimly lit office at the Pentagon, a group of officers and scientists gathered around a long oak table covered with maps of Japan. Every red circle marked a city still standing. Most of the rest, Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, were already ruins from B-29 firebombs. The question now was simple but unspeakable. Which city would die to show the world what America had built? Major General Leslie Groves sat at the head of the table, hands clasped. Next to him, physicist Dr. John von Neumann sketched blast radii across a map. Each circle was miles wide. Each one represented tens of thousands of lives. The target must be large enough to measure the bomb's effect, Groves said flatly. We need a city untouched by previous attacks with military significance, but no prior destruction. The results must be visible. The list shrank quickly. Hiroshima, a river city of 350,000, sat at the head of the inland sea. It was a military port, headquarters of the Second Army, and a hub for troop transport. Crucially, it had been spared from previous raids, ideal for gauging the bomb's power. Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest arsenals, was added next. Niigata, a port on the Sea of Japan, was chosen for its industrial output. Nagasaki, wedged between steep hills, was a shipbuilding center, but considered a backup target. Hiroshima stayed at the top of the list. While Groves debated coordinates, half a world away, the B-29s of the 509th Composite Group arrived at their forward base, Northfield, Tinian Island, in the Mariana Chain. From the air, it looked like an aircraft carrier carved from coral. 6 parallel runways stretching toward the Pacific. Every movement there was classified. Crews operated under false orders. Even neighboring bomber groups didn't know what silver plate meant. Colonel Paul Tibbets, tall, self-assured, and only 30 years old, walked the perimeter each evening, smoking in silence. His crew didn't yet know what they would carry, but they knew it wasn't conventional. We were told this one bomb could end the war, Navigator Theodore Dutch Van Kirk recalled later. That was all we needed to hear. Back in Japan, civilians were starving. Food rations had fallen to under 2,500 calories a day. Trains carried refugees, not troops. Yet the military leadership refused surrender. General Korochika Anami, Japan's war minister, told the emperor, "To yield now would disgrace our ancestors. Let every man become a weapon." That same week, Emperor Hirohito's private advisor, Koichi Kido, urged peace. But the cabinet was split. They wanted Soviet mediation. They still believed Stalin would help negotiate favorable terms. They didn't know the Soviets had already promised to enter the Pacific War against Japan within weeks. Inside Los Alamos, the scientists who had built the weapon wrestled with its moral cost. Dr. Oppenheimer wrote a final note to Washington, warning that the uranium bomb, unlike the plutonium design tested at Trinity, had never been tested before. It might not detonate. Truman's military advisors shrugged. The risk was worth it. They had only one uranium core, and they would trust the physics. July 31st, 9:45. A coded message reached Tinian. Special bomb will be ready within the week. Await further instructions. That same night, the USS Indianapolis left San Francisco carrying the weapon's key components, the uranium projectile and target for Little Boy. It raced across the Pacific at top speed, unescorted, to deliver its deadly cargo. 4 days later, it arrived at Tinian and disappeared from history until Japanese torpedoes sank it days later on its return voyage. 880 sailors were left drifting in shark-infested waters, a forgotten tragedy that claimed more American lives than the bomb it had delivered. By early August, everything was ready. The B-29s were painted silver for high-altitude flight. The crew of Enola Gay practiced emergency climbs to escape shock waves. Every bolt, every instrument was inspected. On August 5th, orders came through. Primary target, Hiroshima. Secondary, Kokura. That night, as the island slept under humid Pacific air, technicians moved the bomb out of its guarded assembly hut. The casing was olive green, stenciled "Little Boy." Soldiers watched as it was hoisted into the bomb bay using a hydraulic lift. Tibbets signed off the loading manifest at 2:30 a.m. and gave his crew a quiet briefing. "We're about to drop the first atomic bomb in history. It'll be big. Stay sharp." No applause, no speeches, just silence. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6th, the Enola Gay roared down the runway and lifted into the dark sky, followed by 2 weather reconnaissance planes, Straight, Flush, and Jabet into third. The flight would last 6 hours. Below them, the Pacific shimmered under a waning moon. In Hiroshima, sirens had sounded several times that week, but always ended in false alarms. The residents were used to the distant drone of B-29s passing overhead. They believed, somehow, their city would be spared. At 7:09 a.m., radar picked up a small formation of aircraft approaching from the south. Air defense officers saw only 3 blips, too few for a raid. They canceled the alarm. In the air, the crew of Enola Gay checked circuits, armed switches, and fuses. Captain William Deke Parsons, the Navy ordnance officer, crawled into the bomb bay to insert the final detonator mid-flight. It was too dangerous to load on the ground. His hands trembled slightly. When the task was done, he exhaled and whispered, "She's live." The plane climbed to 31,000 feet. The target was in sight, a river city shimmering in morning haze. At exactly 8:15:17 a.m., Bombardier Thomas Farabee looked through the Norden sight and called out, "Target in sight! Bombs away!" Little Boy fell silently for 43 seconds. Below, children walked to school. Commuters crossed the Ioi Bridge. Its distinctive T-shape made it the aiming point. In one heartbeat, the sky turned white. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan, 8:15 a.m. For a brief, impossible moment, the people of Hiroshima saw 2 suns in the sky. One, warm and distant. The other, white and alive, bursting into being above the city center. At 1,900 feet above the Ioi Bridge, Little Boy detonated with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The light came first, blinding, total, searing through retinas before nerves could react. In less than 1/10 of a second, the temperature at ground zero soared to over 4,000 degrees Celsius. Shadows burned into concrete. Roof tiles liquefied. Bodies became outlines of ash. Every glass window within 10 miles shattered at once. The shockwave raced outward at nearly 1,000 feet per second, flattening everything in a circle over 2 miles wide. Entire districts vanished. Wooden houses burst into flame. Bridges buckled. A city of 350,000 was erased in less than a minute. A U.S. Army camera aboard the Enola Gay caught the moment. A vast, rising column of smoke spiraled upward, dark at the base and pure white at the top, mushrooming above the clouds. "My God," co-pilot Robert Lewis whispered. "What have we done?" Below, Hiroshima was no longer a city. It was a living furnace. Those who survived the initial blast staggered through ruins that glowed red hot. Skin hung from their arms in ribbons. Eyes were gone. The air smelled of burned flesh and ozone. A woman ran into the river, her clothes aflame. The water itself boiled. Fires merged into a single, roaring firestorm. The explosion's vacuum pulled oxygen toward the center, feeding the inferno. Winds reached hurricane speeds, sucking debris and people alike into the flames. By midday, the city was a sea of fire. Dr. Shuntaro Hida, an army physician stationed outside the city, recalled, "I saw a light like a magnesium flare, then a violent blast. When I arrived downtown, everything was burning. People were lying in the streets, their faces swollen, their hair burned away. Some begged for water. Some were already dead. Hospitals had been destroyed. The few doctors who survived worked in open lots, using torn cloth for bandages, rainwater for antiseptic. Thousands died within hours from burns and trauma. Thousands more would die in the coming days, from something no one yet understood. The radiation, invisible, silent, and merciless, seeped into every wound and lung. Victims who seemed unhurt collapsed days later, vomiting blood as their hair fell out. The Japanese called it Genbaku-bio, the atomic bomb sickness. The Emperor's Palace in Tokyo received the first report at noon. The radio message was confused. A new type of bomb. Tremendous explosion. City almost completely destroyed. Within hours, American radio broadcasts confirmed it. The United States had dropped an atomic bomb. Truman, aboard the cruiser Augusta in the Atlantic, received the coded message, results clear-cut and successful in all respects. He called a press conference that evening. At 11 a.m. Washington time, his voice echoed through radios around the world. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. No one outside the Manhattan Project understood what those words truly meant. But inside Japan, the message was unmistakable. The United States now possessed a weapon that could annihilate a city in seconds. Still, Japan did not surrender. The Supreme War Council met that night in Tokyo. General Anami argued that only unconditional surrender could destroy Japan's soul. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo urged immediate peace through the Soviets. The emperor listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Meanwhile, 800 miles south, the men of the 509th Ontinian were already preparing another weapon. The second bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium design, was more complex and more powerful. The order had already been given before Hiroshima fell. If Japan did not surrender immediately, the next target would follow. In Hiroshima, rescue teams worked through the night under an orange sky. There were no sounds of engines, no electricity, only the cries of the dying. A survivor named Akiko Takakura later said, "There was no city left. The smell of death was everywhere. I walked past my school. There were no children left to find." By morning, August 7th, a gray ash began to fall from the sky. Fallout from the firestorm. The rivers were clogged with corpses. The few surviving firefighters used bamboo buckets to throw mud on burning rubble. At 10 a.m., U.S. reconnaissance aircraft flew over the ruins, capturing the first aerial photographs. What had once been Hiroshima's castle, army base, hospitals, and schools were gone. Erased, leaving only a blackened scar. General Groves in Washington examined the photos in silence. "This," he said, "was just the beginning." The scientists at Los Alamos were shaken. Many had cheered when they heard the bomb had worked. Then came the casualty estimates, over 70,000 dead in a single day. The mood turned cold. Leo Szilard wrote in his diary, "We have crossed the line into an unknown future, and still, the Japanese War Council refused to yield. They thought Hiroshima was a one-time weapon, a terrible but singular act. They did not know another bomb was already on its way to Tinian. In the charred ruins, a U.S. weather plane circled, measuring radiation. Beneath it, tens of thousands of people lay motionless, and others crawled through the wreckage looking for lost children, lost mothers, lost meaning. By August 8th, the skies over Japan darkened again, but this time not from bombers. The Soviet Union had declared war. Their armies poured across Manchuria, overwhelming Japan's last hope for negotiation. And just hours later, a B-29 named Boxcar rolled to a stop on Tinian's runway. Its bomb bay was open. Inside, a sphere of plutonium waited. The second sun was ready. August 9th, 1945. Tinian Island, Pacific Ocean. The morning air was heavy with heat and tension. Mechanics moved slowly beneath the floodlights, sweat rolling off their backs as they guided the massive, olive-colored bomb toward the waiting B-29. Its name, stenciled in white paint, read simply, Fat Man. Inside the bomb bay of Boxcar, Commander Charles W. Sweeney stood in silence, watching the crew secure the clamps. Compared to Little Boy, this weapon was bulkier, deadlier, and more uncertain. It used a plutonium core, compressed by a precise sequence of high-explosive lenses. If even one charge failed to detonate symmetrically, the bomb could fizzle. Major Sweeney's voice was calm as he briefed the men. Primary target, Kokura. Secondary, Nagasaki. If weather or mechanical issues arise, we turn back. This isn't a suicide run. The men nodded, though none believed they'd return unchanged. At 3:47 a.m., Boxcar lifted off the coral runway, its engines straining under the weight of Fat Man and 7,000 gallons of fuel. Two accompanying planes followed, the Great Artiste carrying scientific instruments, and Big Stink for photographic observation. As the formation climbed into the night sky, few on Tinian realized the war's final act had begun. 6 hours later, the crew crossed the southern coast of Japan. The dawn light revealed a sky covered in broken clouds, the worst possible scenario. Kokura, their primary target, was hidden beneath a thick haze and smoke from a nearby city firebombed the previous day. 3 times Sweeney circled, searching for a clear visual. Anti-aircraft batteries below opened fire, the black bursts rising dangerously close. Fuel was running low. Orders forbade dropping the bomb without a visual target. Frustration built in the cockpit. "We can't loiter much longer," Flight Engineer Kermit Behan warned. Sweeney banked south toward the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki wasn't supposed to die that day. The city's hilly terrain made it a poor target for assessing blast damage. It was home to Mitsubishi's steel and torpedo factories, but also to tens of thousands of civilians, workers, families, children on their way to school. At 10:56 a.m., as Boxcar approached, the crew found a brief gap in the cloud cover. Behan looked through his bomb sight and shouted, "I've got it!" Below, the Urakami Valley, densely populated, hemmed in by ridges, filled the crosshairs. At 11:02 a.m., Fat Man was released. It fell for 43 seconds, just like Little Boy, before detonating at 1,150 feet above the ground. The flash was white, almost pure. In an instant, the northern half of Nagasaki vanished. The Mitsubishi factory complex, the medical college, and entire residential blocks disintegrated. Temperatures soared above 3,900 degrees. Over 40,000 people were killed instantly. The hills contained the blast, focusing the destruction inward, a cauldron of fire and wind that consumed everything. A second mushroom cloud rose, towering 35,000 feet high. Witnesses hundreds of miles away saw it, mistaking it for a volcanic eruption. The shock wave rolled through the mountains, shattering glass in towns miles from the city center. On the ground, a factory worker named Sumiteru Taniguchi felt the blast before he saw it. Thrown from his bicycle, his back was flayed by the thermal wave. He later recalled, "My shirt and skin had fused. When I touched my back, my hand came away with flesh." Hospitals collapsed. Bridges melted. Survivors fled to the river, screaming for water. Within minutes, a firestorm began, just as it had in Hiroshima. But this time, the flames met the sea breeze and spread faster. Smoke blotted out the sun. At the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, word of the second bomb reached the War Council that afternoon. The generals were stunned. Many had believed Hiroshima was a bluff, a one-time weapon. Now, it was undeniable. America could strike again and again. That same day, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria with 1.5 million men. The Kwantung Army, once Japan's pride, was shattered in 3 days. Every plan for negotiated surrender through Moscow evaporated. Japan was cornered. At 7 p.m., Emperor Hirohito summoned his ministers to an emergency meeting. It would be the first time in Japan's history that an emperor intervened directly in military decision-making. He spoke quietly, his words formal yet tremulous. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The enemy has begun to use a new and most cruel bomb. Continuing the war can only mean the extinction of the Japanese people. Still, some generals refused. General Anami, pale but defiant, argued that surrender was dishonor worse than death. He proposed continuing resistance on the home islands, mass suicide if necessary. "If we must die," he said, "let us die with honor." But the emperor's resolve had hardened. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the loss of Manchuria, the annihilation of Japan's cities, all pointed to one conclusion. On August 10th, Japan's foreign ministry transmitted a message to the Allies through Switzerland. The empire would accept surrender on one condition: that the emperor's sovereignty be preserved. The next morning, Truman's cabinet debated. Some wanted unconditional surrender, as declared at Potsdam. Others, like Secretary of War Henry Stimson, warned that demanding the emperor's abdication would prolong the bloodshed. "If we insist on humiliation," he said, "we may have to drop a third bomb." In Nagasaki, rescue teams searched for survivors. Entire neighborhoods were silent. The few who lived stumbled through a gray wasteland. Radioactive ash coated the ruins like snow. In the city center, near the Urakami Cathedral, hundreds of Christians who had gathered for confession lay buried under the fallen dome. One of the oldest Christian communities in Asia, extinguished in a second. By August 12th, Japan's hospitals were overflowing with the dying. Burn victims screamed without skin, their wounds festering. Doctors had no medicine, no morphine. Radiation sickness claimed hundreds each hour. Yet amid the horror, word spread. The emperor would speak. For the first time in the nation's history, his voice would be heard by his people. In a quiet room beneath the Imperial Palace, engineers set up a recording machine. As Hirohito prepared his address, distant fires still smoldered in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, twin scars on a world that would never be the same again. August 14th, 1945, Tokyo, Japan. Night hung over the Imperial Palace like a veil. Inside the underground shelter known as the Omeisha Bunker, a single microphone stood on a polished wooden table. Its brass stem gleamed under the dim electric light. 2 lacquered phonograph discs waited beside it. Each would record the emperor's voice in one take. For centuries, No living Japanese citizen had heard that voice. It was considered divine, sacred, the voice of a living god. Yet now, as the walls of the empire crumbled, Emperor Hirohito prepared to speak not as a deity, but as a man surrendering his nation. In another room above, guards stood with rifles, uneasy. Rumors had spread through the palace that hardline officers, members of the Kyujo faction, were planning to seize the recording before it could be broadcast. They saw surrender as treason. They intended to stop it at any cost. At 11:45 p.m., Hirohito entered the bunker, dressed in formal military uniform. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. The technicians bowed deeply. The emperor unfolded a sheet of paper, his surrender speech, written in the ancient court dialect few ordinary citizens could understand. He took a breath. The recording began, to our good and loyal subjects. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. His words flowed slowly, measured, mournful. He never used the word surrender. Instead, he spoke of enduring the unendurable. He described a new and most cruel bomb that had caused immeasurable damage, and warned that continuing the war would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. When he finished, the engineers sealed the discs inside a metal container. Guards hid them in a pile of blankets and carried them to a secure vault inside the palace. Minutes later, the sound of boots echoed through the corridors. The coup had begun. Major Kenji Hatanaka, a fanatical officer of the Imperial Guard, led a group of rebels determined to prevent surrender. They surrounded the palace gates, cut phone lines, and tried to seize the recording. Inside, loyal guards hid the discs behind a stack of papers in the office of the Chamberlain. For hours, chaos reigned. At dawn, General Shizuichi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, arrived and confronted the mutineers. His voice thundered through the halls. This madness will only bring shame upon Japan. The emperor's will is final. Hatanaka, realizing the coup had failed, saluted, whispered, "Long live the emperor," and shot himself beneath the palace walls. Hours later, as the sun rose over a broken city, technicians from NHK Radio carried the precious discs to the studio. They had never before broadcast the emperor's voice. No one knew exactly how to introduce it. At noon on August 15th, 1945, Japan fell silent. In homes across the nation, people gathered around their radios. The crackle of static filled the air, followed by an unfamiliar voice, distant, formal, trembling. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Should we continue to fight, it would result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come. Many couldn't understand his archaic phrasing, but the meaning was clear. Mothers began to weep. Soldiers stared blankly at the floor. The Empire of Japan, which had promised victory or death, had surrendered. In the streets of Tokyo, people knelt in silence. Some bowed toward the palace, others screamed in disbelief. Many military officers wept openly, torn between relief and shame. For the first time in modern history, Japan was defeated. Across the Pacific, word reached Washington at midnight. President Truman was awakened by his aides. The war, 6 years of fire, blood, and ash, was over. He stepped outside into the humid night air and whispered, "This is the greatest thing in history." By morning, the world erupted in celebration. In Times Square, New York, crowds swelled into the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers kissed nurses, strangers danced, confetti fell like snow. The photographs, one kiss, one smile, became the symbol of peace itself. In London, Big Ben rang out for the first time since the Blitz. In Sydney, church bells tolled over the harbor. Yet in the Pacific, silence reigned. In Nagasaki, the fires still smoldered. In Hiroshima, survivors lay in hospital corridors, their wounds raw and blackened. The peace came too late for them. Over 200,000 civilians would die by the end of the year, many from radiation sickness no doctor could treat. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito met his ministers once more. His eyes were red, his voice hollow. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. I will shoulder the burden of our nation's defeat. The military disarmed in stages. Japanese troops laid down rifles, dismantled tanks, and set fire to flags. Prisoners of war were released. Ships flew white flags in harbors once filled with imperial banners. But not everyone accepted peace. On remote islands, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and others, isolated garrisons continued to fight for weeks. Unaware the war had ended, some refused to surrender for years. On Tinian, Colonel Tibbets and his crew were ordered home. They returned to quiet ceremonies, medals, and questions none could answer. I did my job, Tibbets said later. If I hadn't, someone else would have. But I never stopped seeing that light. In Washington, General Groves presented Truman with a full report. Operation Centerboard. 2 bombs, 2 cities, unconditional surrender achieved. The world, he wrote, now stands at the threshold of a new age, the age of atomic warfare. On the night of August 15th, Japan lay in ruins, but alive. And from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the modern world was about to rise, haunted by the knowledge of what it had unleashed. August 16th, 1945, Hiroshima. Dawn broke over a landscape that no longer resembled Earth. What had once been a thriving city of schools, tram lines, and wooden homes was now an ocean of ash, twisted girders, and bones. Smoke still curled from collapsed buildings. The smell of death lingered in every breath. In the ruins near the river, a young nurse named Miyoko Matsubara picked her way through debris with bare, bleeding feet. She had been searching for her family for 3 days. When she found her mother's hairpin in the mud, she fell to her knees and wept without sound. Around her, figures moved like ghosts. Silent, hairless, wrapped in burned rags, their eyes hollow and skin hanging loose. There were no birds, no insects. The blast had incinerated nearly all life within miles. Even grass refused to grow. Survivors spoke of a strange, black rain that fell hours after the bombing. Oily, radioactive water that stained skin and poisoned wells. Those who drank it would die months later, their bodies failing cell by cell. In Nagasaki, the devastation was no less horrifying. The valley that once echoed with shipyard sirens was now a cratered plain of melted stone. The Urakami Cathedral, once the largest church in East Asia, lay in ruins, its bronze bells fused into a single mass. Among the rubble, Father Tomei Nakashima found fragments of rosaries, each bead turned to glass by the heat. He knelt and whispered, "Deus, forgive us." The survivors, later called hibakusha, explosion-affected people, wandered between the 2 cities like phantoms. Many had lost everything: families, homes, the ability to bear children. Doctors had no name for their symptoms. Their gums bled. Fevers came and went. Hair fell out in clumps, skin peeled off in sheets. No one understood that their blood itself had been changed. For days, Japan's government could barely function. Communications were crippled, rail lines destroyed. When American reconnaissance planes arrived to photograph the damage, they flew over landscapes so annihilated that even experienced pilots were silent. "It looked like someone had dropped the city into the sun," one officer said. In Washington, those same photographs were laid on President Truman's desk. He studied them without speaking. Hiroshima, a pale smear on the earth. Nagasaki, a ring of black. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, visibly shaken, finally spoke. "Mr. President, the bombs achieved their purpose. But we must pray to God no man ever uses such power again." The newspapers didn't show the truth. Censors forbade images of charred bodies or melted faces. The American public saw only words. "New weapon ends war." Few understood the scale of what had occurred. It would be years before the full horror reached them. Meanwhile, Allied troops began landing on the shattered Japanese homeland. In Tokyo Bay, the U.S. Navy assembled a fleet so vast it blotted out the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. A silent armada waiting for the formal surrender. Among them stood the battleship USS Missouri, gleaming under the Pacific sun. On its deck, preparations began for a ceremony unlike any in human history. But in the shadows of peace, the scientists of the Manhattan Project struggled with guilt. At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer could not sleep. He had seen the photos of Hiroshima. "The physicists have known sin," he told a colleague. General Groves dismissed him coldly. "The job was done. History will judge us." Some, like physicist Leo Szilard, tried to form a scientists' petition to ban future use of nuclear weapons. It was too late. The world had already crossed the threshold. The Soviet Union, now in possession of captured German research, began building its own bomb. Within 4 years, the Cold War would ignite, a race to stockpile the power to end civilization itself. Back in Japan, American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur entered Tokyo on August 30th. The emperor remained in his palace, now just a quiet man in a worn uniform. When he met MacArthur days later, photographers captured the moment. A frail, expressionless monarch beside the towering American general. The old world bowing to the new. MacArthur's first order was mercy. He forbade retribution against Allied prisoners or civilians. His second was reconstruction. Japan was to be remade, disarmed, democratized, rebuilt from ashes. But for the Hibakusha, there was no reconstruction, only survival. Hiroshima's hospitals overflowed. Nurses used charcoal to treat radiation burns. Children were born deformed, their limbs twisted by unseen forces. In Nagasaki, doctors recorded mysterious fevers, bleeding gums, strange cancers no one had ever named before. Yet they continued their work, often barefoot without supplies, their white uniforms gray with ash. When American photographers finally entered Hiroshima, they were speechless. Corpses lay in rivers, stacked beneath bridges. A mother's hand still clutched the small bones of her child. The journalists who saw it could not eat for days. In early September, a Japanese newspaper managed to print a single image before being shut down by Allied censors. A schoolgirl with bandaged eyes, her face swollen, staring blankly into the lens. That photograph would haunt the conscience of a generation. In the months that followed, the survivors began to tell their stories. Quietly, painfully. "I was a child," one woman recalled, "and the sun came down to earth." Another said, "We thought it was the end of the world." But the truth was more complex. The world had not ended. It had begun anew, under the shadow of the atom. Scientists estimated that if the same bomb were dropped on Tokyo, it would have killed 1 million in one instant. And as nations studied the photographs, governments across the world began forming their own nuclear programs. The race for deterrence and survival had begun. In late 1945, President Truman ordered the formation of the United States Atomic Energy Commission, shifting control of nuclear weapons from the military to civilian oversight. Yet the genie was already out of the bottle. In one of his final public remarks before leaving Los Alamos, Oppenheimer looked out at the desert where it had all begun. "The physicists have unleashed a power too vast for human wisdom," he said. "Now, we must learn to live beneath its shadow." The shadow stretched across every nation, every future battlefield, every silent city that might one day vanish in a blinding flash. October 1945. Los Alamos, New Mexico. The high desert that once glowed with triumph had grown silent. Barbed wire still surrounded the laboratory buildings, but most of the workers were gone. The mess halls were empty. The chalkboards, once filled with equations, still bore faint traces of names: Fermi, Teller, Oppenheimer, ghosts of the project that had changed the world. Robert Oppenheimer stood outside his office, gazing at the mountains. He had become a national hero overnight, yet he looked defeated. The newspapers called him the father of the atomic bomb, but in private he whispered another title: the destroyer of worlds. He knew what was coming next. If one bomb could end a war, 1,000 could end civilization. In Washington, the euphoria of victory was already giving way to calculation. Intelligence briefings warned that the Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, had begun gathering data from captured German scientists and uranium stockpiles in Eastern Europe. Stalin, shaken by the destruction of Hiroshima, had ordered an atomic project of his own. The race for the bomb had not ended with Japan's surrender. It had just begun. The birth of the nuclear age. By late 1945, the U.S. military had already drawn up plans for an expanded atomic arsenal. "One bomb is a miracle," General Groves said in a briefing, "but 10,000 will guarantee peace." The logic was simple and terrifying. If every major nation possessed weapons of total annihilation, no one would dare start a war. Deterrence through mutual destruction. The phrase hadn't yet been coined, but the idea had taken root. The grim arithmetic of the atomic age. In November, President Truman established the Interim Committee on Atomic Energy, insisting that the United States must retain control of the bomb until international agreements are possible. But no one trusted such agreements. Not anymore. By 1946, new laboratories had opened at Oak Ridge and Hanford. Engineers worked on designs far more powerful than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, fusion weapons, super bombs, that could release the energy of the stars themselves. The men who built the first atomic bomb now faced a question they could not answer. Had they saved the world or doomed it? Oppenheimer wrote to a colleague, "We have made a thing, a most terrible weapon, that will change the future of man, perhaps end it. The physicists have become the new custodians of death." The occupation. Meanwhile, in Japan, the U.S. occupation under General Douglas MacArthur was transforming the ashes of empire into the foundations of a democracy. Censorship remained strict. Photographs of the atomic ruins were confiscated, survivor testimonies suppressed. American authorities feared that public outrage might ignite a global anti-nuclear movement before the United States could consolidate its new power. In Hiroshima, survivors rebuilt shacks from tin and broken wood. The city's rivers still ran black with ash. Doctors began documenting the long-term effects of radiation: leukemia, thyroid cancer, malformed births. The word hibakusha, atomic survivor, entered the language, but it carried a quiet shame. Employers refused to hire them. Families forbade their children from marrying them. And yet, in the heart of that ruined city, something unexpected began to grow. In 1946, a group of survivors gathered beside the skeleton dome of the former industrial hall and placed a stone marker. Rest in peace, for the error shall not be repeated. Around it, children planted the first trees of the Hiroshima Peace Park. Each August 6th, at exactly 8:15 a.m., the city would fall silent. Bells would toll. Lanterns would float along the rivers, glowing softly in the dark, carrying prayers for the dead and warnings for the living. The Cold War heats up. Across the Pacific, the United States tested new weapons in the deserts of Nevada and on coral atolls in the Marshall Islands. Mushroom clouds rose again, this time captured by color film and broadcast to cheering audiences. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at Semipalatinsk. The balance of terror was now complete. Two superpowers, each capable of annihilating the other. The era of mutually assured destruction had begun. The world entered an arms race measured not in tanks or rifles, but in megatons. Hydrogen bombs followed, devices 1,000 times stronger than Little Boy. A single detonation could erase a city the size of London. By the early 1950s, air raid drills became part of everyday life in America. Children ducked under school desks, as if wood and steel could shield them from fire hotter than the sun. Governments built underground bunkers. Civil defense pamphlets promised survival through preparedness, though everyone knew there would be no surviving a full-scale exchange. The moral reckoning. Not everyone was silent. In 1954, the crew of a Japanese fishing vessel, the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, Lucky Dragon No. 5, was caught in the fallout from a U.S. hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll. They returned home covered in ash, suffering radiation burns. One crewman, Aikichi Kuboyama, died months later, becoming the first civilian casualty of the Cold War's nuclear testing. His final words, "I pray that I am the last victim of an atomic or hydrogen bomb." The incident reignited Japan's trauma. Protests filled the streets. Artists, poets, and teachers began speaking openly about Hiroshima and Nagasaki again. Films like Children of Hiroshima and Hiroshima Mon Amour brought the unspoken horror back into the light. By the late 1950s, peace movements had spread from Tokyo to London and New York. Students marched with banners reading "Ban the Bomb." Scientists who once worked under Oppenheimer now testified before the United Nations, urging disarmament. But the bombs kept multiplying. By 1960, there were more than 12,000 nuclear warheads in existence. A world under the shadow. Every new city skyline, every jet trail across the sky, every satellite launched into orbit, all carried the same quiet dread. Humanity had survived the Second World War, only to live forever beneath the shadow of the Third. Oppenheimer, now stripped of his security clearance for opposing the hydrogen bomb, gave his last public lecture in 1965. His voice was tired, almost hollow. When you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it. And you argue later whether it should have been done at all. He paused, then added softly, "We have argued. We are still arguing." The audience rose in silence, not in applause, but in awe and unease. 8 years after his death, the world would come within minutes of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962, two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, held the fate of humanity in their hands. The shadow of Hiroshima stretched across that moment, invisible but absolute. The bomb had ended one war and started a far more dangerous peace. August 6, 1965, Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. The morning was bright and windless. A bell rang softly across the Motoyasu River. its tone carrying through the crowd of thousands gathered beneath the summer sun. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the city fell silent, not in mourning, but in remembrance. 2 decades had passed since the bomb. The ruins had been rebuilt into a modern city, but in the heart of Hiroshima, time stood still. Beneath the skeletal dome of the old industrial hall, survivors laid white chrysanthemums. Children folded paper cranes. The air shimmered with incense smoke and whispered prayers. On the memorial's granite arch, the inscription still read, "Rest in peace, for the error shall not be repeated." Prime Minister Eisaku Sato stood before the microphone. His voice trembled. "May humanity," he said, "never again know such fire." That same day, across the Pacific, U.S. bombers roared over Vietnam. Napalm burned through jungles. New wars, new flames. Proof that even after Hiroshima, mankind had learned little. The weapons had changed, the will to use them had not. The legacy of the bomb. In America, Hiroshima had become both symbol and justification. Proof of victory, but also a mirror of guilt. Museums displayed models of the bomb, its mechanics and engineering brilliance. School textbooks framed it as a necessary evil that saved lives. But within Japan, the story was simpler and more human. The bomb had not saved, it had consumed. At Hiroshima University, doctors continued studying the survivors. Their research revealed a grim truth. Radiation damage did not end with those who lived through the explosion. It lived on, in genes, in cells, in unborn children. Babies were born with fragile bones, missing limbs, malformed hearts. Some died within days. Others lived only to be shunned by society. The Hibakusha faced whispers, rejection, fear. Yet they persisted, organizing, speaking, writing, building. They became living witnesses to what the modern world preferred to forget. One survivor, Keiji Nakazawa, was a 6-year-old boy when the bomb fell. He lost his entire family. Years later, he turned his trauma into art. A manga titled Barefoot Gen, drawn with trembling hands. It showed what official photographs never dared. Mothers clutching melting children, fathers reduced to shadows. It was brutal, unfiltered, and true. Nakazawa once said, "I drew so no one could say they didn't know." The philosophers of destruction. In universities and think tanks across the West, scholars debated the morality of the bomb. Could any weapon of total annihilation ever be justified? Did Hiroshima end the war, or merely begin a darker one? Philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that the atomic bomb had made politics obsolete. War, once fought for land or survival, had become the power to erase existence itself. Albert Einstein, who had signed the 1939 letter urging Roosevelt to develop the bomb, later called it the greatest mistake of my life. And yet, deterrence remained the cornerstone of peace. As one Cold War strategist famously put it, "We live because we are afraid to die." By the 1970s, treaties like the Non-Proliferation Agreement sought to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. Nations pledged restraint, even as they refined new delivery systems. Intercontinental missiles, submarine-launched warheads, weapons that could cross oceans in minutes. Peace became a balance of terror. In a world where destruction could come in 15 minutes, fear became civilization's last defense. Hiroshima speaks. In Japan, the survivors' voices grew louder. Poets like Sankichi Toge wrote verses that bled memory. Give back the human race, give back the peace, give back the sun, give back the world we once had. Their words reached Europe, America, the Soviet Union, carried by activists, priests, and journalists. The Hiroshima Peace Declaration, read each year on August 6th, became a moral compass for the post-war world. It warned not of revenge, but of responsibility. Yet the world continued to walk its thin line between deterrence and destruction. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster would again remind humanity of its fragile control over the atom. And in 2022, as new powers built new weapons, the ghost of Hiroshima would return. Silent but watching. The survivor's pilgrimage. In the late 1970s, a frail woman named Setsuko Thurlow, who had been a 13-year-old schoolgirl in Hiroshima, began traveling the world. She carried a single message. I saw the flash. I saw my classmates burned alive. If you listen to me, perhaps they will not have died in vain. She spoke at universities, UN assemblies, and even at disarmament conferences where generals and politicians fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats. Her presence was disarming, her voice calm yet unrelenting. Nuclear weapons, she said, are not a defense. They are the end of defense. When the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, Setsuko stood on the stage, her hair silver now, her voice steady. I dedicate this award to all those who perished in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their spirits are with us. We must never give up until the last nuclear weapon is gone. In the audience, diplomats wept, memory and forgetting. Today, Hiroshima is a city of glass towers, streetcars, and laughter. Children play where shadows once burned into stone. Tourists buy postcards at the Peace Museum, stare at the blackened watches stopped at 8:15, and step back into the sunlight. But the silence remains. The air itself seems to remember. Every August 6th, at the exact moment of detonation, the crowd still bows its head. The bells ring, echoing across rivers that once boiled. For those who listen closely, the sound carries something more than mourning. It is a warning, a reminder that the line between civilization and extinction is drawn not in treaties or technology, but in conscience. Oppenheimer's words, spoken 2 decades earlier, still hang over the world, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish. The physicists have known sin. And yet, as nuclear powers continue to arm, as nations threaten and test, the lesson of that sin remains unlearned. The bomb was never just a weapon. It was a mirror, showing humanity its own reflection, illuminated by the brightest light ever made. August 6th, 2025, Hiroshima. 80 years to the minute since little boy fell from the sky, the city stood silent once again. The rivers shimmered beneath the morning sun. The rebuilt skyline reflected in still water. At the center of Peace Memorial Park, survivors, now frail and few, sat in wheelchairs before a sea of white flowers. Behind them, rows of schoolchildren bowed their heads. At 8:15 a.m., the bell tolled. Its sound lingered in the humid air, crossing generations. From the ashes of war, Hiroshima had become a city dedicated not to vengeance, but to memory. The atomic bomb dome, left exactly as it stood that morning in 1945, loomed over the ceremony like a witness that could never die. Beside it, a young student read the annual Peace Declaration, her voice trembling yet clear. We, the children of the future, will never forget what happened here. We will never allow it to happen again. The survivors, the hibakusha, nodded quietly. Some wept, some closed their eyes. The youngest among them was now in her 70s, the oldest over 100. Their bodies bore the marks of radiation, but their presence embodied something greater: endurance, the legacy of the bomb. 80 years later, the world still lived beneath the shadow of the atom. Over 12,000 nuclear warheads existed across the planet, smaller in number than during the Cold War, but infinitely more precise, more powerful, and more deployable. Missiles could now cross continents in under half an hour. Submarines carried enough firepower to destroy civilization several times over. And yet, the memory of Hiroshima remained the only true restraint. Every new generation of scientists and generals had studied the photos. The melted stone, the glass fused with bone, the stopped watches, the silent streets. Every president, prime minister, and dictator since 1945 had stared at those images and known that pressing a single button could end the world. The power that once belonged to gods was now contained in metal cylinders buried under deserts and oceans. And the fate of all humanity rested on the wisdom of a few. But history is fragile. Memory fades, and peace, like glass, can shatter in a second. The bomb is a warning. In 1962, the world came within a breath of nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov ignored a false radar alert that showed 5 American missiles inbound. His decision not to retaliate may have saved the planet. In 1995, a Norwegian weather rocket triggered another false alarm. For a moment, Moscow's nuclear briefcase was opened. Each incident, each near miss, reminded the world that peace survived not by design, but by chance, by the restraint of a single mind. Even now, in 2025, new powers rise, new rivalries simmer, and the old ghosts stir again. Nations modernize arsenals in the name of deterrence. Hypersonic weapons shrink warning times to minutes. Artificial intelligence calculates launch trajectories faster than humans can intervene. The margin for error grows smaller every year, and in that narrowing space lies the true legacy of Hiroshima. Not destruction, but the fragile miracle of restraint. The human memory. At the Peace Memorial Museum, a single display draws visitors into silence. A charred tricycle, once ridden by a 3-year-old boy named Shinichi. The blast threw him from it. He died that night. His father buried the tricycle with him in their garden. Decades later, it was unearthed and placed behind glass. Children from around the world pressed their faces to the display, staring at it as if trying to understand how a child's toy could become an artifact of apocalypse. Teachers explain, but the truth can't be taught, only felt. In a nearby exhibit, a survivor's voice plays through speakers. I remember the light. I thought the sun had fallen. Then everything went dark. For visitors, it is history. For the Hibakusha, it is forever. Science and conscience. In universities and research centers, physicists now study quantum fields, fusion energy, and artificial intelligence. The new frontiers of human knowledge. Many are inspired by Oppenheimer's legacy, brilliance shadowed by regret. On laboratory walls around the world, one quote appears again and again. Scrawled in chalk or etched into plaques, the physicists have known sin. Modern scientists understand that the same genius that split the atom can also heal, powering cities, curing disease, exploring the stars. But they also know that progress without morality leads back to the desert of Alamogordo, back to that moment when light devoured sand and silence. Technology evolves, human nature does not. The survivor's last message. As the 80th anniversary ceremony concluded, a frail woman named Keiko Ogura, one of the last remaining eyewitnesses, was helped to the podium. She had been 8 years old when the bomb fell. Her voice was faint, but her words cut through the stillness. When I close my eyes, I still see the flash. I still hear the cries. I am not here to accuse. I am here to remind, because forgetting is the first step to repeating. She paused, her hand trembling on the microphone. We are the last generation who saw it with our own eyes. Soon, the world will have only our words. Promise us that you will remember them. The crowd stood in silence. Even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. The weight of memory. As night fell, lanterns were lit and placed gently on the river. Hundreds, then thousands, drifting downstream, tiny flames floating through the darkness. Each carried a message written in ink. Peace, memory, never again. From above, the lanterns looked like stars reflected on the water. The same stars that had once watched over a burning sky. Somewhere in that reflection lies the meaning of Hiroshima. Not revenge, not guilt, but the fragile hope that knowledge can lead to wisdom, that horror can lead to humanity. Because the truth, as every survivor knows, is that the bomb was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of a new one. One where the power to destroy life is matched only by the responsibility to protect it. The era that began with fire and silence continues still, balanced on the edge of memory. And as long as the bell of Hiroshima rings each August morning, there remains one enduring vow, whispered by those who saw the light and lived to tell it. Never again.